The day I'd been dreading for 2 years had finally arrived. It was the moment I was supposed to meet David's father, the man who cast a long shadow over our entire relationship. Arthur Sterling, the elusive billionaire, whose wealth and reputation towered over all of us, was a figure I had only heard about in hushed tones. His name was synonymous with success, but also with ruthlessness. Everyone had a story about Arthur, but none of them painted him as a kind man. On the day of the dinner, I was already on edge. David had made it clear this wasn't a simple meet-the-parents situation. No, this was a test. And failing this test wasn't an option. We'd been preparing for this day for months, but no amount of preparation could truly ease the anxiety that gripped me as I received the summons. It didn't come in the form of a friendly invitation. It wasn't even an email you'd expect for dinner invite. Instead, it arrived as a cold, sterile letter from a law firm, its message sharp and to the point. Mr. Arthur Sterling requests the presence of his son, Mr. David Sterling, and his companion, Ms. Ava Peters, for a formal dinner at his private residence. The message struck me like a lightning bolt. A dinner invitation had never sounded so ominous. David had been anxious about this moment since we'd first gotten together. He told me stories about his father, stories that made him sound more like a myth than a real person. Arthur had built an empire from the ground up, only to disappear from public life after a series of controversial decisions. He'd even disowned his oldest son for marrying someone he didn't approve of. And now, it was my turn to face judgment. The days leading up to the dinner had been a blur of rehearsals and last-minute instructions from David. He was a nervous wreck, which made me even more nervous. He kept telling me, don't talk about your nonprofit job. He thinks charity is a weakness. Don't mention your parents' background. Stick to neutral topics, art, history, economics. David's voice had been strained with fear as he handed me a list of rules to follow. Wear the navy blue dress I bought you and the cashmere scarf. He values appearances. And for the love of God, do not be late. Tardiness will destroy everything. I tried to remain calm, though my stomach churned with anxiety. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a performance, and it had to be flawless. I spent the entire morning of the dinner getting ready as if I were preparing for an audition rather than a family dinner. I practiced my responses in front of the mirror, trying to make sure I said all the right things. I pressed the navy dress and cashmere scarf until they were perfect, even though I could feel the tight knot of nerves in my stomach tightening with every passing minute. I had to be perfect. For David, for me, and for the future we were about to build. The train ride felt endless. With every passing minute, my nerves were growing, and I had to constantly remind myself not to let panic take over. David had already arrived at his father's mansion, as he had left earlier to prepare for the dinner. The plan was for me to take a taxi from the station to the estate, but as I stepped off the train, something inside me just couldn't bear the thought of sitting in a car. I needed to clear my mind. The weight of the day's importance was suffocating. With every step, the pressure felt heavier. The air was thick, the world around me moving at a pace I couldn't keep up with. I decided to walk. The streets of this wealthy enclave were a stark contrast to everything I knew. Mansions that seemed to stretch endlessly, each one more grand than the last, hidden behind iron gates and tall hedges. It was a world so foreign to me, I felt like an intruder out of place. I checked my watch. Time was slipping away, but I still had 20 minutes. My footsteps echoed in the stillness of the empty street as I walked, my heels clicking against the quiet pavement. Everything felt surreal, the sharp contrast between the vast wealth of these streets and the simplicity of my own life. It wasn't long before I saw him, sitting alone on a park bench, shivering in the cool breeze. He stood out like a sore thumb in this pristine neighborhood, an elderly man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face lined with the hardship of his life. He looked completely out of place, and yet, in a strange way, he was the only thing in this perfect town that seemed real. I should have walked past. I should have stuck to the plan, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the kindness my grandmother had always taught me, or maybe it was simply the humanity in his eyes. Whatever it was, I couldn't walk away. I slowed my pace, approaching him cautiously. "Excuse me, sir," I said softly. "Are you all right?" His gaze shifted upward, meeting mine. His eyes were clear, a striking shade of blue. "Just a bit cold, young lady," he said with a raspy whisper, his voice barely audible. "And I missed the lunch service at the shelter." It was a small thing, but it struck me in a way I didn't expect. I looked down at the sandwich I'd packed for my train ride, the only food I had with me. Without thinking, I pulled it out of my bag and held it out to him. "It's not much," I said, "but it's yours." He stared at it for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he took it with a quiet nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but sincere. I felt a warmth spread through me, but there was still something more I could do. I glanced down at the cashmere scarf draped around my neck, the one David had insisted I wear for the dinner. It was expensive, over $700, but none of that mattered in this moment. I untied it and gently wrapped it around his shoulders. "You need this more than I do," I said, my voice gentle. He looked at the scarf, then back at me, and his eyes softened. "You are a very kind woman," he said quietly. I smiled, wished him well, and began to walk away. But as I did, I checked my watch and felt my stomach drop. I was officially going to be late. As I hurried down the path, the warmth of the scarf and the gratitude in the old man's eyes lingered in my mind, but it did little to ease the knot of panic growing in my stomach. I glanced at my watch again. 5:12 p.m. I was now 12 minutes late. It seemed like such a small thing, but in this world where every second mattered, it felt like an eternity. The thought of disappointing David haunted me. He had warned me. He had told me how critical this meeting was, how everything depended on me making the right impression. I had already failed before I even walked through the door. I pushed myself harder, my heels sinking into the soft grass that lined the path leading up to the Sterling estate. The gates loomed ahead, massive wrought iron structures that seemed to mock my every step. I pressed the intercom button with a trembling hand, trying to steady my breath. "Eva Peters here to see Mr. Sterling." The silence that followed felt like a sentence. And then, finally, the mechanical buzz of the gates opening. I stepped forward, walking onto the long, winding driveway, flanked by towering oak trees that seemed to press in around me. This wasn't just a driveway, it was an avenue to a different world. Every detail of the estate screamed wealth and power: gilded gates, perfect landscaping, and a mansion that stood like a monument to success. As I approached the entrance, the mansion itself came into view. It was so grand, so imposing, that it felt less like a home and more like a fortress. 3 stories of stone, with dark windows that stared out at me like 100 unblinking eyes. And waiting for me at the top of the grand stone steps under the portico was David. He wasn't smiling. David was pacing back and forth, his posture rigid with anxiety, his phone clutched in his hand. The moment he saw me, his face, which had already been pale with worry, twisted into a grimace. "Ava, where in God's name have you been?" His voice was low but urgent, almost a whisper as he rushed to meet me. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "You're 17 minutes late, Ava. 17. I told you how important this was. This is a disaster." I felt the sting of his words, but there was nothing I could say. The weight of my mistake pressed down on me like a ton of bricks. "I'm so sorry, David," I whispered, my heart racing. "I know, I was walking from the station and there was an old man on a park bench." He interrupted, disbelief in his voice. "A homeless man? You stopped for a homeless man?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yes, David. He was cold, he hadn't eaten. I gave him my sandwich." David's eyes widened in disbelief. "You gave him your sandwich?" He repeated in a horrified whisper. "You were late to meet my father, the most important man in my life, because you stopped to talk to a homeless man." His voice cracked with frustration, and I felt the sting of his judgment. But what could I do? I had chosen to help someone in need, even if it meant risking everything. But then, his eyes shifted to my neck. My stomach dropped. "And the scarf," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where is it?" "The scarf I bought you specifically for tonight, the $700 cashmere scarf." I hesitated for a moment before whispering. I gave it to him, he was so cold. David's face contorted in a mix of horror and fury. "You gave it away, a $700 scarf? To a bum?" His voice rose, and I could see his hands trembling. "Do you have any idea what's at stake tonight?" He hissed. "This isn't just some casual dinner. This is a test that could decide the entire future of our lives." I stood there, stunned, as he continued to speak, each word a sharp blow to my self-esteem. The man I loved was no longer worried about my well-being. He wasn't even angry, not really. He was terrified of his father, terrified of losing everything. David's words echoed in my mind, but something deep inside me pushed back. His fear, his panic, it was suffocating. I had chosen kindness over punctuality, compassion over appearances. And even though his disappointment cut through me like a knife, I wasn't going to apologize for it. I wasn't going to apologize for the choice I'd made. Still, I couldn't ignore the truth in his words. This dinner, this meeting with his father, wasn't just a dinner, it was a test of my worth, my value. And right now, I felt like I was failing. David's grip on my arm tightened, his anxiety palpable. "You don't understand, Ava. This is my father. You can't mess this up." Not this time. We were at the grand entrance now, the massive oak doors looming in front of us. My heart raced as we approached, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the silence. The house felt colder now, its grandeur overwhelming. It wasn't a home, it was a monument to power. As we entered, the butler, a tall, thin man dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform, appeared like a shadow, his expression as impassive as ever. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling will see you now." I felt David stiffen beside me. He straightened his tie, his anxiety escalating. His eyes were wide with panic, but there was a strange desperation there too. "Just remember," he whispered, barely audible, "let me do the talking. Don't mention the man on the bench. Don't mention the scarf. Please, Ava, please be perfect." Perfect. I hadn't been perfect, and that thought haunted me as we were led down a long, silent hallway. The walls were adorned with priceless art, each painting more intimidating than the last. Everything here was designed to remind us of one thing: wealth, power, influence. I was just a small part of this world, a temporary fixture, a stranger in a foreign land. The butler stopped in front of a set of towering, dark wood doors. "Mr. Sterling is waiting for you in the main dining room." I couldn't help the shiver that ran down my spine. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading. But the truth was, I wasn't afraid of meeting David's father anymore. No, I was afraid of what I had already done, of how I had failed. I had betrayed David's expectations, and now it was too late to take it back. As the doors creaked open, I could hear a low, almost inaudible voice from inside, a man speaking quietly. It wasn't the voice of someone angry, demanding, or even dismissive. It was calm, low, familiar. David's hand tightened around mine as we entered, but I wasn't focused on him anymore. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the vast, luxurious dining space. A long mahogany table stretched across the room, polished to a mirror-like finish. The crystal chandelier above glimmered in the muted light, casting a cold glow over everything. The room itself felt like an abyss, as if it could swallow you whole. And then at the far end of the table, I saw him, the old man, the homeless man I had helped just an hour ago, sitting at the head of the table, draped in my scarf. My heart stopped. David, oblivious to my frozen state, kept speaking in frantic whispers beside me, but I couldn't hear him. I couldn't hear anything except the blood rushing in my ears. There, in the chair at the end of the table, sat the man whose face I had just seen, shivering, hungry, and lost, and yet here he was in the most imposing seat of all in front of us. His eyes met mine as he smiled, a warm, genuine smile that instantly put me at ease. But before I could process it, I heard David's voice, strained and panicked, breaking through my shock. "Ava, what is it?" His voice sounded far away. "What are you staring at? Let's go." But I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, watching a scene that didn't make sense. The man who had been homeless just moments ago was now seated in a place of power and authority. My scarf, the one I had given away, was draped elegantly around his shoulders. David's hand tugged at my arm, urging me to move, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the man sitting at the head of the table. I could hardly breathe, my mind racing in disbelief. The homeless man, the one I had helped just an hour ago, was now seated like a king in this lavish dining room. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. "Ava, what are you doing?" David's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. His panic was palpable, and I felt a pang of guilt deep in my chest. I had failed him, and now this. My heart skipped a beat as I slowly turned to look at David. His face was ashen, his expression a mix of horror and disbelief. He hadn't noticed the man at the head of the table at first, too focused on me. But now, following my gaze, he saw him too, and the reaction was instantaneous. David's posture collapsed. His wide eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite place: fear, confusion, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of recognition. His mouth opened, but no words came out for a long moment. "Father?" David finally stammered, his voice trembling as if he had just seen a ghost. What are you doing here? What is this?" The man at the head of the table, the man who had been a stranger just hours ago, didn't answer immediately. His gaze, though, never left me. He smiled again, a soft, knowing smile that made my knees weak. And in that moment, I knew without a doubt that this wasn't just some coincidence. He shifted slightly in his chair, the cashmere scarf I had given him still draped comfortably around his shoulders. "Welcome, Ava," he said, his voice warm, raspy, and so unexpectedly kind. "Please come in, have a seat." I stood frozen, unable to process the scene unfolding before me. I had thought this was a dinner with a billionaire, a powerful, distant figure who would judge me harshly for every flaw. But instead, I was staring at a man who had no resemblance to the cruel, unapproachable patriarch David had described. The tension in the room was thick. David, who had always seemed in control, was now a shell of himself. His eyes were wide, his hands shaking slightly. "Father, please," he said, his voice cracking. This isn't funny. Why are you pretending to be?" But Arthur Sterling, the man I had once thought was merely a legend, simply shook his head. His expression softened, his blue eyes filled with a quiet, almost fatherly pride. "You're confused, David," Arthur said calmly. "But you shouldn't be. You know I value character above all else. It's the only thing that truly matters to me." David's jaw dropped as if the words had physically struck him. I watched the whole thing unfold, stunned by the sheer complexity of it all. Arthur turned back to me, his eyes now brimming with approval. "I apologize for my appearance earlier," he said, his voice warm but laced with something deeper, something far more meaningful. "It's an old habit of mine, you see. I don't always present myself as the world expects." I took a shaky breath, my mind spinning. What had just happened? The man I had just given my scarf to was Arthur Sterling, the man who could make or break David's future. He wasn't just some homeless man, but a genius who had carefully orchestrated everything, from the way I met him to the way he wanted me to be tested. David was still processing the revelation, and for the first time, I could see him as a child again, a little boy lost in the shadow of a father who would never be satisfied. Arthur's gaze flicked toward David with an expression I could not interpret. "David," Arthur said, his tone hardening slightly, "you look surprised, but you shouldn't be. You, of all people, should know how I test those who seek my approval. The people who walk into my life must do more than impress me with their wealth or their charm. They must show me something real." David stood there, a mixture of fear and confusion in his eyes. He had failed to understand the one thing that mattered to his father, the truth about people, about kindness and integrity. Arthur's gaze turned back to me, his eyes warm once more, and he smiled. "You, Ava, you passed my test. You showed me something I've rarely seen in this world. Kindness. A simple act of compassion when no one was watching. That's the true measure of worth." David, still reeling from the shock, opened his mouth to speak, but Arthur raised a hand, silencing him. "I know you're disappointed, David," Arthur said, "but this is the truth. The choices Ava made today, the ones you thought were mistakes, are the very ones that matter, the ones that will lead to real success. The rest of it," he gestured to the mansion around us, "is nothing but performance." The silence in the room stretched on, heavy with the weight of Arthur's words. David was still frozen, his mouth agape as he tried to process the revelation. His entire world had just shifted in a way he wasn't prepared for. The man who had controlled his life, his destiny, had just shattered his carefully constructed reality. And now, Arthur's gaze was fixed on me, his approval unspoken but palpable. "David," Arthur said again, his voice no longer filled with anger but something far sharper, disappointment. "You see, Ava passed my test not because she was perfect. She's not perfect, none of us are, but she chose something real, something that can't be bought or faked." He turned to me, a soft smile curling at his lips. "Ava, your sincerity, your kindness, it's something rare. You did what most people would never do, and for that you have my respect." David's expression faltered as he slowly stepped back, unable to process what was unfolding. He looked at me, then at his father, a mix of rage and confusion boiling in his eyes. "This isn't fair," he muttered under his breath. "I followed all your rules. I tried to be perfect." Arthur's piercing gaze softened, but only just. "Perfect? You think perfection matters to me?" He shook his head slowly, his voice dropping low. "No, David, perfection is an illusion, a game people play to fit into a mold that doesn't even exist. It's the human soul, the integrity, the kindness, the depth that I value. Ava has those qualities. You, my son, have yet to see them. David's face twisted with frustration, his hands trembling as he clenched them into fists. I did everything for your approval, he said, his voice cracking, his gaze now pleading. And she just gives away a scarf to a stranger and gets all the praise? How is that fair, father? Arthur sighed deeply, almost sadly, before he leaned forward, fixing David with a gaze that was both fatherly and unyielding. You misunderstand, David, he said quietly. This isn't about Ava winning anything. It's about you losing yourself in the process. You've spent your whole life trying to gain my approval, and in doing so, you've lost sight of what truly matters. You've focused on superficial tests, on appearances, things that are fleeting and meaningless. Meanwhile, Ava showed me something that lasts longer than money, longer than power, longer than status. Arthur's voice was firm, his gaze unwavering. She showed me humanity. David recoiled at his father's words, his face pale, his entire body stiff with the realization that he would never measure up in his father's eyes. The realization was too much for him to handle. He took a step back, his face hardening, and I saw the first crack in the veneer of his perfect life. Arthur didn't give him a chance to respond. He stood up from his chair, his gaze now shifting to me with an almost quiet admiration. Ava, please take a seat. His voice softened again. The night is still young, and there's much to discuss. I hesitated for a moment, still stunned by everything that had just unfolded. My heart was racing, but there was a strange calmness in me now, a sense of clarity I hadn't felt before. Arthur Sterling had just turned everything I thought I knew about wealth, status, and success on its head. He hadn't judged me for my background, my job, or my wealth. He had judged me for something deeper, something I had almost forgotten in my rush to meet his expectations. I walked to the table, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. As I sat down at the chair Arthur had indicated, my heart settled a little, but the silence in the room remained heavy. I glanced at David, whose face was still frozen in disbelief, and then back at Arthur, who was now looking at me with an almost fatherly pride. I've been waiting for a long time to meet someone like you, Ava, Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying across the table. Someone who hasn't lost their humanity in the pursuit of wealth or success. Someone who understands that true value doesn't come from money, but from how you treat others. I felt my cheeks flush at his words, but there was no embarrassment. There was no need for pretense anymore. I had done something real. And in that moment, I realized that the tests I had feared so much were irrelevant. I had passed the only test that mattered. Arthur's eyes softened as he looked at me, his expression now filled with something gentler than the sharpness he had shown earlier. Let's enjoy our dinner now, Ava, he said with a smile, his voice warm. It's been a long day, and it seems we have a lot more to discuss. David, who had been standing in the background like a ghost, finally moved toward the table, though he remained at the far end, his posture defeated. His gaze was locked on the floor, unable to meet his father's eyes. The butler entered, quietly placing the first course before us. The tension in the air remained thick, but for the first time that evening, I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't the one on trial anymore. Arthur Sterling may have been ruthless in his world, but tonight, he had shown me a different side of himself. And that side, though unexpected, was more human, more compassionate than I ever thought possible. I wasn't just a test subject for him. I was someone who had passed the test of life's true value. The dinner went on, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. The grand mansion, the gilded walls, the perfectly polished silverware, all of it seemed distant, irrelevant now. The conversation flowed naturally between Arthur and me, and for the first time that evening, I could see David sitting in the shadows of his own discomfort. He barely spoke, his once perfect facade crumbling under the weight of his father's judgment. Arthur, with his strange wisdom, didn't ask me about my finances or my background. He didn't care about my family's modest means or the nonprofit I worked for, something David had begged me to keep quiet about. Instead, Arthur was genuinely interested in me. He asked about my childhood, my values, the things that had shaped me. I talked about my parents who had raised me with love and little money, teaching me that the value of a person was measured not by wealth, but by kindness and integrity. It was strange, the way Arthur's interest felt like a revelation. He wasn't asking me to fit into some mold, some prescribed idea of success. He was simply asking me to be real. And for the first time all evening, I felt a profound sense of relief. David, on the other hand, sat at the far end of the table, completely disengaged. His eyes were fixed on his plate, his fork moving aimlessly through the food in front of him. He wasn't angry, he was broken. I could see the internal struggle in him. He had always sought his father's approval, had always tried to be the perfect son, the perfect heir. But here he was, failing, and the weight of that failure seemed too much for him to bear. Arthur, however, didn't allow the tension to linger. His voice softened, his gaze returning to me with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the harshness of his reputation. "You've done something rare, Ava," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've reminded me of what really matters in this world: compassion, integrity, humanity. These are the things worth holding on to. I've spent decades searching for something like that." David's head shot up at his father's words, his confusion turning to a raw, almost desperate anger. "But, Father," he interjected, his voice trembling, "this isn't how the world works. This is a mistake. You don't understand. I've worked my whole life to prove myself to you." Arthur's eyes hardened for a brief moment, and then he exhaled, his shoulders sagging with the weight of years of disappointment. "David," he said softly, "you've been working to prove yourself to a version of me that doesn't exist. You've been trying to win a battle that was never meant to be fought." I watched as David's face collapsed, his pride and fear unraveling before my eyes. The truth was out in the open now, and there was no hiding from it. Arthur wasn't just disappointed in his son for failing to meet his expectations. He was mourning the fact that David had spent so much of his life chasing a shadow of success that didn't truly exist. As the last course was served, I felt a shift in the room. The air was no longer thick with tension, but with a quiet realization. Arthur was right. All the superficial tests, the rules, the expectations, none of them mattered. What mattered was the kind of person you were when no one was watching. It was about the choices you made, not the image you tried to project. Arthur stood up slowly, his posture regal yet somehow weary. "It's time we all faced what's truly important," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "David, you have a remarkable woman by your side. Don't make the mistake of underestimating her or her values. She's the one who will lead you, not me." David's face drained of color as his father's words sank in, but Arthur didn't give him a chance to respond. "Go home, David," Arthur said, his tone final. "Go home and be the man she deserves. The choice is yours." I felt my heart break for David as he stood up, his body rigid with shame. But this was his moment to make a choice, too. To face his father's judgment and decide who he wanted to be moving forward. As we walked to the door, Arthur turned to me, his expression softening once again. "Ava, we'll discuss the future of the company later. But tonight, I think we've both learned something. True wealth, true power is not measured by the things we have, but by the kindness we show to others." I nodded, a sense of clarity flooding my mind. It was the first time in a long while I'd felt at peace with who I was. I wasn't perfect, and neither was David. But in this strange, surreal moment, I realized that I wasn't afraid of failing anymore. I had already passed the test that truly mattered. As the night came to a close, I stood next to David, whose face was pale with a mix of humiliation and relief. We left the mansion, walking down the long driveway in silence, the weight of the evening settling heavily between us. The ride home was long and quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. David's hand was cold, but when he spoke, his voice was different, vulnerable, honest. "Ava," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. I've been so focused on trying to be perfect for him, for this family, that I forgot what really matters. I've tried so hard to make you fit into a mold, but I see now that it's me who needs to change." I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. We had both survived Arthur Sterling's test, and we were going to be okay. Epilogue: the wedding. 3 months later, David and I stood in the garden of my parents' house, exchanging vows in front of close friends and family. It wasn't the extravagant affair David had initially envisioned, but it was perfect. Simple. Honest. Arthur Sterling was there, not in a suit that looked like it came straight from a high-end designer, but in the same cashmere scarf that I had once given to the homeless man on that fateful day. The irony wasn't lost on me, and I smiled as he winked at me from across the garden. David had changed, and so had I. We had learned that the greatest wealth is not in material things, but in the choices we make, the love we give, and the integrity we hold onto, no matter the circumstances.